What do you think of when you think of the modern American Navy? Probably aircraft carriers and guns bigger than a car. If so, then you're wrong. We're going to take you back in time to when the Navy was attacking Canada and was no bigger than some fishing boats with cannons attached to them. Today, we're going to be talking about the founder of the American Navy, John Paul Jones. John Paul Jones, or John Paul, was born in Scotland on July 6, 1747, and became a sailor at age 13. After killing a mutinous sailor, he fled to Virginia in 1775 and joined the Continental Navy because he was sympathetic with the colonist cause. Jones took command of a 24-gun frigate, the USS Alfred, on December 7th, 1775. Okay, you may be asking yourself, what's a frigate? Well, if you are, I'm impressed right now because I'm pretty sure you're not. But I'll tell you a little about warship sizes right now. Okay, so today I'm here with
Captain William C. McKinney, United States Navy, retired.
what is a frigate and what makes a ship one?
Well, a frigate is, in the old-time sailing sense, was a specifically purpose-designed ship to be a warship. It wasn't converted from a merchant ship or anything. It had stronger decks. It had, gun emplacements on board. It had, special things about it that made it a warship specifically.
All right, and what is a brig and what makes a ship one?
Well, in relationship to what we're talking about here, which is John Paul Jones, it's important to remember the early colonial navy was mostly converted merchant ships, and a brig was one of those kind of ships. It was a good-sized ship, a medium-sized ship. It had mainly square-rigged sails, so the classic big square sails, not the triangular ones you see on more modern ships. But the brig specifically had usually two masts, and on the aftmost mast, it also had what they called a fore and aft sail. Very maneuverable, designed for maneuvering in tight quarters, not terribly fast.
All right, and what's a sloop?
Now, a sloop back then would be a smaller, usually coastal ship, fore and aft rigged with the triangular sails instead of the big square sails. They were very quick, could get in and out of engagements very quickly, and could be lightly armed, but not too heavily armed.
Wow, thanks so much for that. Anyway, back to your regularly scheduled programming. So what role did John Paul Jones play in the Revolutionary War? He was commissioned as the first lieutenant in December 1775 on a ship named the Alfred and was later given full command of the ship Providence after the Battle of Block Island. He also commanded the ships Ranger and Bonharm Richard. This was the ship that John Paul Jones would use to fight one of the first naval battles of the war, the raid on Canseco. To understand why this raid was important, we first have to understand where it is. If you look at a map, you will see that Nova Scotia is very close to Maine, so it made sense that the colonies would raid this area because it was a British stronghold. On September 22nd, 1776, John Paul Jones and his ship Providence left Boston and headed for Nova Scotia and attacked the village of Canseco there. His crew sank 15 ships and damaged a lot of property on the shore. He later moved inland and attacked Piet de Graat and Archat on the Isle de Madame, Nova Scotia, where 15 ships and over 300 men surrendered to him. As he was coming back to Boston in late November, he took a raiding party ashore and burned transport carrying food to Canada in a warehouse full of whale oil, and also captured a small schooner. In the end, he went home with 6 prize ships. He later came back and freed 300 American prisoners who were working in British coal mines. Another one of John Paul Jones's battles on the province was the raid of Nassau. The British governor of Virginia ordered gunpowder in Williamsburg to be shipped to the island of New Providence in the British colony of the Bahamas. Now, the colonies needed this gunpowder to fight because, well, gunpowder. So the Continental Congress sent Isaac Hopkins and his fleet to get the powder. Hopkinson's fleet was sent to the island along with 200 Continental Marines. As they were sailing down to the Bahamas, the fleet captured 2 Loyalist-owned sloops. A local ship captain saw the coming American fleet and went to warn the British at the island's 2 forts, Fort Nassau and Fort Montego. The American plan was to hold out until daybreak and use the 2 captured ships and John Paul Jones's ship Providence to send the Marines in and take the forts with no alarm going off. Unfortunately, the British saw the 2 ships in the morning light and raised the alarm. The local governor there, Montfort Brown, ordered 4 guns on Fort Nassau to be fired to alert the local militia. Those militia were mostly unarmed. 2 of the 4 guns broke. Now here's the thing about the 2 forts that the British used. Fort Nassau was founded in 1697 by Dutch merchants trading in the area. When the British used it, it was almost 100 years old and not in the best condition. It was poorly defended from amphibious assaults and its walls couldn't hold its 64 cannons. Fort Mangal was much newer, being built in 1742, but only having 17 cannons and was on the eastern side of the harbor there. The British, in an act of genius, put the gunpowder in Fort Nassau. When the Americans heard the guns go off, they realized that they had lost the element of surprise and aborted the assault. The Americans regrouped and the British planned out what they were going to do. The British sent out a lieutenant named Buke to investigate the American activity. The lieutenant, who was outnumbered, sent out a flag of truce to the Americans to find out what they were planning. Meanwhile, a force of 80 militiamen, led by Brown, arrived at Fort Bengal. Brown had heard of the American size by now and ordered 3 of the guns fired. He left the fort almost undefended and sent some of his troops to Fort Nassau. Brown then sent out Buke again to parley with the Americans in order to wait on the command officer of the enemy to know his errand on what account he has landed his troops. While this was happening, the Americans took over Fort Mangao, and after they took the fort, the force of 200 Marines and 50 sailors decided to stay the night at the fort. Later that night, Brown decided to try to get the barrels of gunpowder out of the harbor. 162 of the 200 barrels were loaded onto ships and sent to Florida. This happened because the Americans forgot to put a ship at the harbor's entrance, leaving the American fleet somewhere else. Early the next morning, the town gave the soldiers at the fort the town keys. The Americans stayed for 2 weeks and took the remaining 38 barrels and any other supplies they found and headed home. This is when John Paul Jones was given command of this ship. John Paul Jones commanded this ship from May to November when he and his crew captured a brig named Britannia. He also captured a total of 16 ships in September, all along the route from Delaware Bay to Bermuda. After John Paul Jones left command of that ship, Providence captured a transport ship along with its old friend the Alfred. On that transport ship were supplies and tons of winter clothing for the British fighting in the north.
After fighting with his superiors about the campaign plans, he was given command of the USS Ranger. After his rule in the province, the Ranger was one of the most important ships that John Paul Jones commanded during the Revolutionary War. The Ranger was an 18-gun frigate that was sent to France in June 1777 to help the U.S. and to try to get France to help defeat the British. It arrives in Nantes, France, which is here. Eventually, France agrees to help us, and John Paul Jones sets sail to come back to the U.S. Or does he? Well, no. Instead of coming back home to the U.S., he decides to head to the British Isles themselves and wreak havoc there. As they were leaving France, the French Navy gave the Ranger a 9-gun salute, which was the first time a U.S. vessel was saluted by a foreign warship. So the Ranger went on the Irish Sea, captured a British ship named Dolphin, and scudded it. He later captured a ship named Lord Chatham and sent it to Brest, France. The Ranger then sank an unnamed Scottish ship in another sloop. John Paul Jones led a raid on the English port town of Whitehaven. John Paul Jones had difficulty leading 2 small boats and a total of 30 men into the Whitehaven port because the 2 forts were guarded by the entrances. John Paul Jones' team of men successfully took over the southern fort, while another boat was sent to take over the northern fort. However, while the John Paul Jones team was taking over the south port and disabling its cannon, the northern team claimed that a noise scared them and they came back to John Paul Jones' team. John Paul Jones decided to set the south fort on fire to compensate for the failed attack on the north one, and ended up setting the town on fire. After this raid, he moved to the town of Selkirk with the intent to hold the Earl there for ransom. John Paul Jones wanted to release the American settlers in exchange for the Earl. However, the Earl wasn't there and they decided to raid his house instead. While on their way, the Ranger, a ship on port there named the HMS Drake. The Drake sent out a small boat to formally ask the Ranger why they were there and who they were. While this was happening, John Paul Jones raised the American naval colors and the Drake's question was answered. The attack caught the British off guard. The British shot 4-pound cannonballs at the Ranger, but its hull was too heavy for them to do any real damage. By this point, the 2 ships were close enough to allow the crew members to shoot muskets at each other. The British, being unprepared, ran out of cartridges that the black powder was in and had to take unwrapped powder and carefully put it in the muskets to fire it. By this point, it was clear that the Americans were going to win the battle and the British surrendered. After the surrender, John Paul Jones sent out men to look at the Drake and assess the damage. It was found that the ship's captain and lieutenant were killed in the fighting. The next 3 days were spent repairing the ship and slowly moving away from Carrickfergus. The Drake had damages around its hull and sails. The American ship was not damaged as badly, but it still had some damages to its sails. Now obviously, the British were mad that an American ship was able to show them up in their own home turf, or waters. The news of him defeating the British ships reached France before he did with his ship and the Drake. He became a hero in France as well as in the US. In Britain, he became a bloodthirsty pirate that would stop at nothing to kill people. The British also learned an important lesson that day, which was that the Royal Navy could not defend shipping, coasts, or even its own fighting vessels against the American raiders. So the British stationed artillery along its coast and put volunteer battalions on the coast as the last line of defense in case of an attack.
After his battle with the HMS Drake, John Paul Jones was moved to command the JSS Bonhomme Richard. It was a former merchant ship. John Paul Jones decided to head back to Britain with a small fleet of French ships named the Pallas, Vengeance, and the Alliance. The small fleet headed north, passing Yorkshire at Flombourg Head. It saw merchant ships being guarded by the Serapis and the Countess of Scarborough. John Paul Jones moved his ship behind the Serapis and had the cannons loaded. That night, the Serapis called the Bonhomme Richard. The captain of the Serapis asked John Paul Jones, "What ship is that?" Jones replied, "I can't hear you." Pearson then demanded, "What ship is that? Answer at once, or I shall be under the necessity of firing into you." They stared each other down before firing at each other. John Paul Jones realized that his ship was slow and outgunned, so he decided to try and board the ship instead of shooting at it. After attempting to, and failing, the captain of the Serapis called to John Paul Jones to ask if he wanted to surrender. He asked, "Has your ship struck?" which is old sailing language for surrendering. Jones replied with one of the most famous quotes of the American Revolution, "I have not yet begun to fight." After a few more attempts to board the ship, the front part of the Serapis caught onto the sails of the Richard. The captain of the Serapis had its anchors dropped in an attempt to help the escape, but it only ended in the two ships locking together. For a long time, the crews of the ships fought in hand-to-hand combat. People on the British coast watched in horror as the pirate, John Paul Jones's crew, attacked the Serapis. He was widely considered a pirate there and was rumored to be just as savage as other pirates in the last 200 years. The hand-to-hand combat of the American was deadly and accurate, which caused heavy British casualties. While this was happening, the ship Alliance started to attack Richard in hopes of claiming the glory for themselves. As both the Richard and the Serapis were on fire and started to sink, the Richard's war colors were shot away. The Richard ship's master called to the Serapis ship, believing that Jones was somehow killed, that they were surrendering and to stop firing. When the British asked if that was true, John Paul Jones said, "I may sink, but I'll be damned if I strike." The Americans threw a grenade onto the Serapis, causing a chain reaction and exploded the gunpowder below deck. After hours of fighting, the Serapis surrendered. The Serapis captain said this after the fighting: "It is with great reluctance that I am now obliged to resign this, for it is painful to me, more particularly at this time, when compelled to deliver up my sword to a man who may be said to fight with a halter around his neck." No one knows exactly how many people were killed, but the casualties are said to be 287 people, 170 for the Americans and 117 for the British. After the surrender, John Paul Jones expected Richard. It had taken on 5 feet of water and there was no way to repair it. The crew ended up abandoning it, letting it sink, and boarded the Serapis. They then set sail for the Netherlands, as it was closer than France. They ended up on the small island of Texel. Because the flag that the Richard flew was long gone, the Dutch designed a new flag for the U.S. based on what Ben Franklin described it to be, which was, "The flag of the United States of America consists of 13 stripes, alternately red, white, and blue. A small square in the upper angle, next to the flagstaff, is a blue field with 13 white stars, denoting a new constellation." The Dutch designed this, which in my opinion looks super cool. John Paul Jones took command of the Serapis, which he sailed to and sold to France as a prize ship. The King of France gave John Paul Jones the title of Chevalier and gave him a sword. The British, who at this point were embarrassed, sent out even more warships to try and find him, which was a good thing because more warships in Britain meant less warships in the US. After the war, John Paul Jones's contract with the US ran out and he was left without a job. He joined the Russian Navy and fought in the Black Sea during the Russo-Turkish War. After some time in the Imperial Russian Navy, he was kicked out due to allegations of him being involved with a very young girl. This did not look good on his record, and Jones wouldn't find work in either the Swedish or Danish navies. He eventually died in Paris because of interstitial nephritis, which is TB of the kidneys. He was 45 when he died. He was buried in St. Louis Cemetery. His remains were later exhumed and returned to the U.S. with a military escort, where they remain today at the U.S. Naval Academy Chapel in Annapolis, Maryland. John Paul Jones was one of the greatest naval war heroes in our nation's history and played a very important role in the Revolutionary War.
So while you were at the Naval Academy, did you hear any stories about John Paul Jones?
Well, you have to understand that John Paul Jones is one of the definite fathers of the Navy. He's probably our earliest major hero in the Navy. Um, the most famous story about him, of course, is the engagement between his ship, the Bonhomme Richard, and the HMS Serapis. And what he's most famous for, and why he's kind of the core of our philosophy, is just his bravery and his daring and his willingness to go outside the box. Here we are in the Revolutionary War, engaged against by far the most powerful navy in the world, the Royal Navy, and this guy sets sail from the colony's coastline, goes all the way over to England, and takes the fight to them with various engagements. In one engagement, he actually did, excuse me, a land engagement where he landed troops and went up and burned a Scottish castle and stole their silver in China and stuff. Which actually led to a big concern by the British people that, wait a minute, this is no longer an engagement over there. They're bringing the fight to the home. But his battle against the Serapis has gone down in legend, including when he got asked if he was ready to surrender. What had actually happened was his flag, the colonial flag, had gotten shot off of the Bonhomme Richard. And the British captain hauled aside and said, do you wish to surrender? Because that was a sign of surrender. And that's where his famous quote, surrender, I have not yet begun to fight. Now, between you and me. Most historians don't think that's exactly what he said. They think he said something more along the lines of, I may yet sink, but I will not strike. In other words, hey, this ship could sink, but I'm never going to surrender. And so that philosophy, everything has really made him, one of the early founders and legends and myths in the United States Navy today.
So did you end up seeing his grave while you were there?
Oh, yeah.
Were there any myths around it?
He was originally buried in Paris, France, in kind of a crummy little graveyard in Paris, France. Theodore Roosevelt, when he was president, actually brought his body back. And at the time, they were building the chapel at the Naval Academy, which is a gorgeous copper-domed chapel. And while they were building it, they said, hey, let's put John Paul Jones's crypt in the basement. So it's actually right underneath the dome, all the way down in the basement. It's a marvelous marble sarcophagus that's held up by dolphins, and a lot of memorabilia is down there. And I probably would go visit it once a week or so, just after chapel or whatever. But it's funny, especially now that I've been back there so many times, I've gotten talking to the Marines, because it's guarded 24 hours a day by a Marine. There's always a Marine in the crypt. And you talk to those Marines, and every single one of them will tell you it's haunted. They say some weird stuff happens down there. You'll just see things out of the corner of their eyes. They'll hear noises. One of them actually claimed he saw the crypt, the top of the sarcophagus open and shut. But yeah, it's pretty wild to be down there. It's a neat sight. If you're ever in Annapolis, that's a gotta see.
All right.
Any other myths? Any other myths about him at the Academy? There's some good luck myths, like going down and throwing a penny towards the sarcophagus before exams is always good luck, things like that. But really, he lives more in legend than myth. We all know his stories. We've all read his, the excellent biography of him. So we definitely identify with John Paul Jones.